Okay, so if we're going to be using rubrics, we need to figure out exactly what are we trying to measure with this rubric. And so this is part one of this process. And so let's look at what we've got here. We want to definitely begin with the criteria as we begin to develop writing a rubric, creating a rubric, and we break that process down step by step. This is the first thing that we look at as we go to develop a rubric. So we begin with the criteria once the assignment has been chosen. So once you figured out what assignment, obviously, that you are creating this rubric for, because a rubric is assignment specific, task specific, what are the criteria that will demonstrate good work toward the goal for student learning for the task that the rubric is to assess? So again, we don't want to create a rubric for what we've taught. We want to create a rubric for what the goal is for student learning for this particular topic, unit, chapter, standard, whatever we're covering in our class for whatever time period it's been, the last 2 weeks, whatever. Then we want to know what the goal is for the student learning for that time period, and then that's what we want to develop our criteria to be based around. What categories should a student or peer or teacher be looking for to determine if the student's work demonstrates that learning? So the criteria essentially is the first column of the rubric. It represents the items, the specific criterion that we are using to determine whether students have learned what they were supposed to learn, again, in whatever topic we have just covered. And so we need to be very particular about those criterion as we choose them. These qualities need to be named, obviously, within that column, and described, and we'll get to that part later, as targets for students to aim for. And so we want to essentially categorize what the student learning needs to be. That's what our criteria are. We want those criteria to be appropriate and important. Okay. Choosing as criteria the most appropriate and important identifiers of what the task is intended to assess. So again, we want to look at what they're going to be doing to demonstrate their learning, to perform their learning, and we want to choose criteria that will match up with that goal in mind. Not characteristics of the task itself, right? We've talked about that. We don't want to know that there's a cover page that has, their name on it and whatever. We want the criterion to become very specific to the learning outcome of what the task is supposed to show, demonstrate their learning. So for a report on a famous person, say, is our assignment, we're not looking for things like cover page, graphics in the report, a good bibliography, those kinds of things. That's just part of the instructions. But instead, we're looking for things like selection of subject. Who did they choose to do their report of a famous person on? Analysis of person's contribution to history within their report. Did they support historical facts? Did they support their reasoning and logic within their report in historical facts and reasoning? So the criteria are a little bit more in depth. Not a little bit, they are much more in depth than very basic kind of surface things like cover page and so on. Appropriateness is the most important criterion for developing your criteria for your rubric. Appropriateness. And what we mean by appropriateness here is that, again, these categories that we're choosing are appropriate to show that the students have demonstrated, performed their learning that hits the objective, the standard, the learning outcome for this particular topic or unit or whatever we're measuring and assessing here. appropriateness. So here are the desired characteristics of criteria for a classroom rubric. Okay, these are the things that we're looking for, and this is a table out of your textbook. Okay, characteristics so we're going to list the characteristics here, and so the criteria are appropriate. That's the number one thing that we are looking for. Okay, an explanation. What does that mean? What are we looking for appropriate? We want each criterion to represent an aspect of a standard, curriculum goal, instructional goal, or some student learning outcome, an objective that students are intending to learn. Or that's the overall goal of why we're even covering whatever we're covering in our class, is because it comes from our course of record, comes from standards, state standards, whatever they may be. This is why we're covering whatever we're covering. Okay? And so we want our criteria to show that we're covering that content. And we want our students to demonstrate that learning. Our criteria are definable, right? They're not out there and loose and floating and so on. Each criterion has a very clear, agreed upon meaning that both students and teachers understand. So you can't write your rubrics or your criteria in teacherese, right? They need to be written in a format that your students understand. And that's going to depend, obviously, on what level, grade level, age level, that you teach. But your criteria need to be understandable by your students. Okay? They're not done in some, education language out there that hardly anybody understands. They need to be observable. Hopefully this one is semi-obvious. Since we're building our rubrics to score our students based on their performance of their learning, their demonstration of learning, they have to be observable. Okay? We can't have characteristics that say they will know something. Well, how do you know they know something? It has to be something they're doing, some behavior they're demonstrating that's observable by you to measure that they know it, right? Okay? So each criterion describes a quality in the performance that can be perceived. So typically that would be either seen or heard by someone other than the person performing. So typically it would be you as the teacher, but maybe you're doing a peer review of things here, and so their fellow students need to be able to see or hear their performing of whatever you're looking for within your rubric, right? The criteria need to show that. They need to be distinct from each other. Okay, and really what we're looking for there is that there's no overlap. There's no reason for overlap, or else you are, the potential is there to kind of double whammy your students. If they didn't do a particular thing, then they lose points in multiple places in your rubric, and honestly, that's just not fair. And so we want the criteria to be distinct from each other. So each criterion identifies a separate aspect of the learning outcome that the performance is intended to assess. They're separate from each other. There's no overlap in things, okay? But on the same line, we want to make sure that they cover everything as well that we're expecting students to learn. So that's what we mean by this one. They are complete. So all the criteria added up, basically, every piece, every row inside this first column, together, they describe the whole of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. Okay, so they need to be distinct from each other. They need to not overlap, but they also need to cover everything that you're looking for a demonstration of their learning. They also need to be able to support each description along a continuum of quality. So basically what that means is that if they're going to be the things we're looking for, right, the criteria for each thing, they need to each be able to have a scale to them, to where, as we build out the rest of our rubric, they're going to be able to be measured along a scale, and that's each cell within that scale, those can be distinct from each other as well. And so each criterion has to be described over a range of performance levels is what we mean by that. Okay, so whatever each one of our criteria are, maybe they can be scaled to it's obvious this student performed at a 4 level, and it's obvious this student performed at a 3 level, 2 level, a 1 level for each particular criterion, just as an example there. So in choosing criteria, okay, we want to begin with the intended learning outcome, right? Not what I taught, but what I want my students to learn based on standards and so on. The instructional goal that we are trying to assess. That's what we want to build our criteria on. So based on that, here's the question, the big question. We need the, here's the big question that you need to ask yourself. Okay? It is called the criterion question. What characteristics of student work would give evidence for student learning of the knowledge or skills specified in the standard? Okay. However the standard is described, we want to find characteristics of student work that would demonstrate those skills or the knowledge or whatever, however the standard or objective is written. This is the criterion question. That's what you want to ask yourself every time you develop a criteria within your, or a criterion within your rubric as you build each one. Okay. Criterion really should be characterized by multiple tasks. Let me kind of give you an example of this. Okay, let's say that this is our standard, basically an English standard. Students can cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. So this is a 6th grade standard. Students need to be able to do that. Okay, now I would say that's not necessarily written in student language. I would do my best to rewrite this standard maybe for students to understand, broken up in your criterion. Okay, that's kind of your job as you develop your rubric for them to understand. What am I supposed to do now? Okay, so some tasks. Students might read a passage and then answer a question or set of questions in writing. Pretty basic assignment there, right? But that's one way they could demonstrate how they can explicitly or draw references from what they've read. Students can read a passage and participate in a discussion. So maybe you teach an online class. It doesn't have to be online. It could be a discussion in class. It could be a discussion in Twitter. It could be, the discussion could be anywhere. But they can read a passage and participate in a discussion with their peers. Okay, because they can cite specific references, maybe even quote things from the text that they read, or draw inferences. And hopefully within that discussion, they can learn whether they were correct inferences or not. They might read a passage and explain what it meant to a fictional younger peer. So we all know that the best way to learn something is to teach it, right? So essentially your students could teach this to a younger student in however you want to have them do that. They could explain it in a video. They could write an explanation, however you want them to do that. Maybe they would read a passage and create a list of literal and inferential conclusions that can be drawn from that text. So maybe you're just going to have them list them. Okay. They might compare and contrast 2 texts based on any of these same tasks. Okay. So the criteria that I choose, no matter what the task is that they're doing here, the criteria I choose will still fit this task because I'm writing my criteria to the standard. Doesn't matter what task they do to do that. Maybe it does just a little bit, depending on how you do your assignments, but this is the goal. So you want criteria that are appropriate to the learning that is common to all the tasks. Okay? And this may be what we've talked a little bit about, is that it gives students choice in what they submit as well to demonstrate their learning. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but hopefully that helped you a little bit to come up with your criteria, the first column, what you're going to be measuring in categories, the categories that you're going to be measuring for within your rubric for a particular standard or whatever you're going to be assessing. That was our goal within this, and we'll look at the rest of the rubric in more detail as we progress.